Hello, my dear friends. Primitive people used to inhale smouldering cannabis smoke in caves to communicate with their ancestors. That's not a myth. It's an ancient document. Over thousands of years, cannabis has appeared in ancient rituals, Chinese medicine rooms, mosques, and even World War II trenches. Once considered a crime, it's now a modern lifestyle symbol. Tonight, we travel from the smoky caves of the Stone Age to the glowing vape pens of today. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and how long you've been there. It's always fun to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to wander deep into the caves of the Stone Age, the air would still carry traces of smoke long gone. On the walls, blackened patches mark where fires once burned, and among the ashes, small seeds lie crushed and charred. They are not grains of food, nor the remains of fruit. They are the earliest evidence of cannabis ever touched by human hands. In the dim light of prehistory, these burnt seeds tell a story of ritual, of fear, and of a strange search for peace in a world ruled by survival. There were no written prayers, no temples, only the flicker of firelight and the rise of smoke curling into the darkness above. Those early humans had little understanding of plants beyond what they could eat or burn, yet they discovered something curious in the thick, fragrant smoke of cannabis. It dulled the senses, softened pain, and made the mind drift into a haze that felt unlike ordinary sleep. It was not medicine as we know it, nor recreation as we imagine today. It was something in between a momentary escape from the hunger, danger, and exhaustion that shaped their lives. It is almost amusing to think that humanity's first experiment with relaxation might have been a group of hunters accidentally setting their future drug on fire. Archaeologists believe the smoke was used during rituals, where entire tribes gathered in circles around fires. The flicker of flames against the walls made shadows dance like spirits, and the rising smoke was thought to carry messages to unseen powers. The smell, though harsh, became part of the ceremony. Some burned the seeds to ward off evil spirits, and others believed the smoke cleansed the body and soul. Without language to explain it, the experience itself became sacred. They breathed deeply, eyes heavy, hearts slowing, as if touching a mystery that no one could name. The ground of these caves still holds small stones blackened with resin. To scientists, this residue reveals that the fires were not meant only for warmth or cooking. It was deliberate, a kind of communication between man and smoke, perhaps the first attempt to bridge the physical and the spiritual through intoxication. The irony is that what began as a holy practice would, thousands of years later, become a habit argued over by lawmakers. In modern terms, it would be like discovering that humanity's first church was also its first smoke lounge. The act of burning itself carried deep meaning. Fire was life, protection, and connection to forces beyond comprehension. To mix cannabis with fire was to merge comfort with mystery. The smoke lingered long after the flames died, clinging to hair and skin, filling nostrils with its strange, calming scent. It might have felt like a conversation between the living and the unseen, or perhaps a small rebellion against fear itself. For a brief moment, in the heart of those caves, the world grew softer, quieter, almost bearable. Of course, they had no words for pleasure or addiction. Their understanding of mind and body was instinct alone. A burning seed that made the night seem shorter was miracle enough. And so, in silence, they kept burning, perhaps without even knowing why. The smoke became tradition. The tradition became belief, and belief became survival. When the winds changed, they moved on, leaving behind nothing but faint traces of ash for future ages to uncover. To imagine those people sitting by the fire, wrapped in furs, faces lit by the orange glow, is to glimpse the beginning of something far larger than they could have understood. They did not know of chemistry, medicine, or spirituality in the way we define them. Yet in that act of lighting, inhaling, and surrendering to the haze, they opened a door that humanity would never close again. It still feels strangely intimate to picture the first spark of curiosity that connected the human mind to smoke, as if even then, people were searching for a way to feel less alone in their own thoughts. Thousands of years later, we can still trace the path of that smoke through every culture that followed. From priests and healers to kings and commoners, the same instinct returned the need to burn, to breathe, and to believe that something unseen could soothe the mind. What was once a ritual born of darkness would spread across continents and centuries, dressed in new meanings but carrying the same ancient comfort. The caves remain silent now, their ashes cold, their secrets buried under layers of time. Yet the story of those burnt seeds lingers, whispering that even in prehistory, humans were drawn to escape the harshness of life, if only for a few breaths of smoke rising toward the unknown. The first traces of cannabis remind us that curiosity and comfort have always walked together. They show that even before civilization, people sought peace through what they could not explain, and somewhere between firelight and darkness, they found it, if only for a moment. The smoke of the Stone Age still drifts faintly through history, thin and ancient, carrying the memory of the first human who felt calm for no reason at all. The earliest fires revealed more than warmth. They revealed desire. From those embers, belief was born, and with it, the first addiction disguised as devotion. Somewhere beyond the ashes, a new age waited, where smoke would no longer rise in caves but in temples and palaces under the gaze of gods. The ancient Chinese did not stumble upon cannabis by accident. It appeared carefully recorded in their earliest medical texts, where observation and superstition were woven together. The plant was called ma, a word that meant numbness, but also balance. To those early physicians, it was both a medicine and a mystery, a substance that could dull pain, calm the spirit, and open the mind to strange clarity. Its roots ran deep into the philosophy of harmony, where the body was a landscape of energy, and every illness a disruption of flow. Cannabis, with its curious power to quiet pain, was believed to restore that balance between motion and stillness. The oldest references to the plant appear in the legendary pharmacopoeia attributed to Emperor Shen Nong, the mythical father of Chinese medicine. He described it as a remedy that could heal hundreds of diseases, from fever to forgetfulness. Later healers wrote of its ability to ease pain and soften the body into rest. They did not know its chemical nature, only that it could make suffering fade into a distance where the mind no longer reached. It is oddly comforting to think that thousands of years ago, people were already inventing ways to take the edge off existence. In the time of the great physician Hua Tuo, cannabis became a tool of surgical courage. His legend tells of mixing the powdered plant into a wine that lulled patients into stillness. Under its spell, he could cut flesh and mend wounds without hearing screams. This was not anesthesia as science knows it, but something more primitive and uncertain. Some patients never woke again. Others awoke praising the miracle that spared them agony. In a world without morphine, this fragile mixture of wine and weed was the closest thing to mercy. Hua Tuo's use of cannabis marked a quiet revolution. It suggested that pain could be managed, not merely endured. That belief alone placed him centuries ahead of his time. In modern comparison, it would be as if a field surgeon discovered anesthesia using herbs and luck, while the rest of the world still used prayer. His methods spread through stories more than through teaching. His writings were lost, his formulas buried with him, but the memory of his experiments endured. Beyond surgery, Chinese healers used cannabis to calm the mind and settle disturbed thoughts. They believed that too much spirit could burn the brain, that restlessness was a sickness of excess energy. The plant, they said, cooled the heart and silenced the ghosts that caused nightmares. It was medicine for the unseen, for the soul as much as the body. In a culture that valued order above chaos, this ability to bring stillness was sacred. The body, like the empire, had to remain balanced, and cannabis became one of its quiet guardians. Merchants sold dried flowers and seeds in small cloth bags at herbal markets. The air was thick with the scents of roots, resins, and leaves. Each bundle promised health, though none could guarantee safety. There were no scales precise enough to measure dosage, no warnings written on the labels. A handful could heal, another could destroy. Yet people trusted their healers, and healers trusted what experience whispered through generations. It was a fragile system of faith built on observation and chance. The plant's dual nature puzzled many scholars. Some claimed it brought enlightenment, others called it dangerous to the mind. It was medicine and poison in equal measure. Too much could blur memory, make the tongue heavy, and turn laughter into confusion. But in moderation, it was said to unlock deep calm and insight. This tension between healing and harm defined its place in Chinese thought for centuries. To lose control of oneself was shameful, but to master the plant's effects was considered wisdom. Even within temples, monks burned small amounts in censers to aid meditation. The smoke rose with their chants, twisting through beams of sunlight that cut across the dim halls. They said it cleared the mind of dust, helping them to glimpse truth without pain or effort. The irony was that a plant used to escape the senses was also believed to sharpen them. I cannot help but find it deeply human that even those who sought spiritual purity found comfort in a bit of chemical silence. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, and the plant's reputation shifted like the winds that carried its scent across the empire. Some emperors banned its use outside medicine, fearing its power to cloud judgment. Others praised its benefits and ordered it cultivated in imperial gardens. Cannabis moved quietly through households, prescriptions, and prayers, never quite disappearing, never fully embraced. It became part of daily life, hidden beneath the surface of routine healing and quiet rituals. Through all its transformations, the core remained the same. Cannabis offered relief in a world where pain was constant and control was fragile. It represented a small triumph of the human desire to soften reality, to make life a little more bearable, even if only for a while. The physicians who prescribed it did not think of addiction or vice. They thought only of suffering and how to ease it. The story of cannabis in ancient China reveals more than the birth of a medicine. It shows the first steps toward understanding the mind's connection to the body and how deeply people feared pain. The plant became a bridge between flesh and spirit, between what was seen and what could only be felt. In the quiet rooms of healers and the smoky air of temples, it whispered the same promise it always has that relief is possible, if one dares to trust what cannot be fully understood. Cannabis entered Chinese history as a healer and stayed as a companion to both body and belief. Its smoke carried not rebellion but reverence, not escape but endurance. And though its meaning changed with time, its purpose remained to ease the unending ache of being human. The ancient doctors saw more than a plant. They saw a path to peace. Their discoveries gave cannabis a sacred weight that would survive centuries. Yet beyond their temples and scrolls, others would take this same plant and twist its use into pleasure rather than prayer. Somewhere far from the empire's borders, new hands waited to light the same smoke for very different reasons. In the heat and dust of ancient India, cannabis was not merely a plant but a divine gift. It appeared in the sacred verses of the Vedas, where sages wrote of 5 holy herbs that could bring happiness and liberation. Among them, bhang was called the herb of the gods, a bridge between mortal minds and celestial understanding. It was believed to be born from the body of the god Shiva himself, who drank it to stay calm during his eternal meditation. To touch the plant was to touch a fragment of the divine, and to drink it was to taste serenity. For thousands of years, it became part of India's spiritual fabric. Sadhus and monks carried it in small clay pots during pilgrimages, mixing it into milk, water, and spices to create a drink that cooled the body and quieted thought. The taste was bitter, the effect gentle at first, then deep and dreamlike. To them, it was not intoxication but purification, a way to dissolve the boundaries between self and spirit. The body would grow light, the mind heavy, and the soul, they said, would rise closer to truth. It is somewhat amusing to imagine that enlightenment, in its earliest form, may have begun with a sip of something that tasted like dirt and devotion. During great festivals such as Holi, when colours filled the air and songs echoed through the streets, cannabis took on a joyful form. The bhang drink was shared among the crowds, poured from large bowls into small cups. It softened tempers, turned strangers into friends, and gave courage to dance and sing through the day. To refuse it was to refuse the spirit of celebration itself. Children watched as their elders laughed and swayed, their eyes glazed with peace rather than wildness. This was not vice but a blessing, a communal trance woven into religion. In temples dedicated to Shiva, priests mixed bhang with ghee and almonds, stirring it slowly before sunrise. The mixture was offered to the deity before being shared with worshippers as a token of divine favour. The smoke of burning leaves filled the air, mingling with incense and chants. To inhale it was to join the gods in stillness, to forget hunger and fear, to rest in the warmth of the sacred. There was no shame in this act. It was prayer made physical. Faith carried on breath. In modern comparison, it would be like walking into a church and finding the congregation sharing a drink that both soothes and sanctifies. As centuries passed, cannabis became embedded in every level of Indian life. Farmers used it to ease pain after long hours in the fields. Soldiers drank it before battle to steady their nerves. Healers prescribed it for sleeplessness and fever. Poets and mystics praised it as a key to understanding existence. It was medicine, comfort, and revelation bound together in one green leaf. The line between religion and recreation was never drawn. To live was to endure, and to endure was to seek relief, whether from gods or herbs. The connection to Shiva gave the plant moral protection. When challenged by outsiders, its defenders would say, "If the Lord himself partakes, how can it be wrong?" No king dared to forbid what was woven into faith. Yet the tolerance had its limits. Those who used too much were seen as drifting away from discipline. Too little showed a lack of devotion. As with all sacred things, balance was everything. To find the perfect measure was to live in harmony with one's own chaos. Travellers from other lands wrote with fascination about India's calm intoxication. They saw people moving slowly, eyes half closed, smiles faint but sincere. It was not the wild drunkenness of the West, but a measured stillness that seemed to erase pain. The plant's reputation spread, though its meaning was often lost in translation. What for the Indian ascetic was a prayer, for the outsider was simply a drug. I find it strangely beautiful that what others saw as escape, they saw as connection, to God, to nature, to peace itself. The ritual surrounding bhang endured for millennia. During processions, devotees carried cups of it through the streets, chanting the name of Shiva as they drank. The mixture varied from region to region, but always contained milk, spices, and crushed cannabis leaves. It was a recipe for transcendence that could be made in any home. Elders taught the young not to fear it but to respect it, as one would respect fire or the sea. Even now, in remote villages, the preparation continues quietly, unchanged by time. Beyond its spiritual role, cannabis served a practical purpose. In the heat of India, it cooled the body and soothed the mind. Labourers who could not afford medicine found relief in bhang. It dulled pain, slowed thoughts, and gave endurance under the sun. For the poor, it was the closest thing to rest. For the rich, it was a doorway to meditation. In a land where life and death were never far apart, cannabis offered a small taste of immortality, if only for an afternoon. The presence of bhang in Indian culture shows how deeply humans can merge faith and chemistry. It was a prayer one could drink, a ritual that required no words. It offered connection to the gods, calm to the weary, and unity to the crowds. No law or empire could erase it because it answered needs older than civilization itself. India's sacred herb stands as one of history's longest human relationships with cannabis. It was not a rebellion, not a cure, but a bridge. It carried souls upward while keeping bodies grounded. It proved that intoxication and holiness are not enemies but twins born from the same longing to escape pain and touch something infinite. The faith that surrounded cannabis in India turned a simple plant into a doorway to heaven. From the Vedas to the streets, from temples to homes, it lived as part of the people's heartbeat. But while India drank its peace in temples, another land would soon burn the same plant for fire and fear. In the desert winds of Africa and the plains beyond, smoke would rise for very different reasons. In the golden dust of ancient Egypt, cannabis was written into medicine long before it was whispered into ritual. On the fragile fibres of the Ebers papyrus, the plant appeared as an ingredient for healing, not indulgence. The physicians of the Nile mixed it into salves and oils, prescribing it for pain, inflammation, and the suffering of women during childbirth. It was recorded with the same calm authority as honey or aloe, a trusted tool in the long fight against illness. The scribes wrote their instructions with reverence, as though each leaf carried a sliver of divine order. Egyptian medicine was a world where science and magic shared the same table. Healers were priests as much as doctors, their remedies half knowledge and half prayer. Cannabis fits perfectly into this balance. It was used to cool the body and settle the spirit, a comfort to the living and a gift to the dying. Women were given mixtures made from its crushed seeds to ease pain, while the sick were anointed with its oils in hopes of chasing away fevers. It is darkly humorous that some of the earliest medical recipes were written by men who healed with the same plants they burned as offerings. Among the temples, jars of powdered cannabis stood beside resins of myrrh and frankincense. The priests believed that scent could carry the soul toward purity. When the smoke of the plant rose toward the carved ceilings, they said it cleansed not only air but thought. The act of burning was both medicine and message, a conversation between body and eternity. To inhale it was to taste the boundary between life and death, a boundary Egyptians spent entire lives trying to understand. In the daily life of the people, cannabis was humble and practical. It was mixed with fat and applied to aching joints, rubbed into temples to ease headaches, and infused into oils for relaxation after long labour. Workers on the riverbanks, soldiers returning from battle, and mothers nursing their children all used it in small doses. Its reputation was not mystical among the poor, only useful. They did not see gods in its smoke. They saw relief, and that was miracle enough. The plant's place among the elite, however, was far more mysterious. Within royal tombs, traces of cannabis have been found among funerary offerings. It may have been placed beside perfumes and ointments meant to protect the soul in the afterlife. In death, as in life, the Egyptians believed that comfort must continue. The same substance that soothed the body in pain was offered to the spirit on its journey beyond. If one compares it to today, it would be as if painkillers were laid beside the dead to help them rest more peacefully in another world. To the priests who guarded these rituals, the smoke of cannabis symbolized purity and protection. It was said to drive away dark forces, guiding the soul safely through the perilous roads of the underworld. Mummies were prepared with resins and oils that might have included its extracts, sealing bodies in layers of preservation and prayer. For them, death was not an end but a transition, and the plant's power helped ease that passage. The combination of medical and mystical use was not a contradiction but a harmony. In Egypt, Every ailment had both a physical cause and a spiritual echo. A fever was not only the heat of the body but a disturbance of the soul. Cannabis, by calming both, became an emblem of balance. Doctors used it for what they could see, priests for what they could not. Together, they maintained the delicate order that kept the Nile civilization alive for centuries. In the bustling markets along the river, merchants sold bundles of herbs tied with a string. The scent of earth and oil hung in the air, thick as heat. Women bartered for medicines, men consulted healers, and in the background, the steady hum of daily survival filled the streets. Somewhere among the baskets of dates and jars of ointment, a handful of green leaves promised quiet relief. The people did not name it sacred or profane. It was simply part of existence. I find it quietly moving that even in a world obsessed with eternity, people still search for small moments of comfort before death. As dynasties changed, the role of cannabis endured. It remained in the physician's scrolls, passed through generations of healers who knew its worth but never its chemistry. They trusted the wisdom of experience, not experiment. To them, knowledge meant continuity. Every cured wound or soothed spirit confirmed what had already been believed. In the soft light of the temple or the harsh glare of the desert, the same leaf continued to serve. Egypt's relationship with cannabis reveals a civilization that sought control over both body and soul. The plant's dual nature mirrored the dual life of the Egyptians themselves, half mortal, half divine. It was both remedy and ritual, comfort and consecration. In the end, it belonged to no single realm but to all of them at once. Cannabis in Egypt was not indulgence. It was an order. It was the breath between pain and peace, between the mortal and the eternal. To hold it was to acknowledge the limits of human suffering, and to burn it was to ask the gods for mercy. Its ashes became part of their soil, its scent part of their prayers, its name written softly in ink that has survived thousands of years. The Egyptians turned healing into holiness, and in doing so, gave the plant a place among both doctors and the dead. Yet beyond their deserts, other peoples were already discovering its power for reasons far less sacred. In lands of cold winds and open plains, the smoke would no longer rise in prayer, but in celebration of survival. Scythian warriors returned from battle covered in blood and dust, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, and their minds haunted by what they had seen. To cleanse themselves, they built small tents of felt, sealed tightly against the wind, and brought in bowls of heated stones. Onto these stones, they threw handfuls of hemp seeds. The air filled quickly with thick aromatic smoke, curling around their skin, stinging their eyes, and sinking deep into their lungs. Inside that heat, they shouted, laughed, and sometimes cried. The ritual was not indulgence but purification, a release of violence through fire and breath. Herodotus, the ancient historian, wrote of it with a mix of fascination and disbelief, describing men who howled with pleasure as they bathed in invisible flames. The Scythians believed that smoke could strip away sin and sorrow. The body, battered from war, needed cleansing as much as the soul. After weeks of killing and wandering across endless plains, this act of steaming themselves in hemp smoke was both physical and spiritual rebirth. It was said that the spirits of the dead clung to the living after battle, weighing them down with grief. The smoke drove those spirits away, leaving warriors renewed. It is almost absurd that the same plant now associated with relaxation once served as the perfume of warriors fresh from killing. Inside the tents, the air grew so dense that breathing became an act of surrender. The warriors' muscles loosened, their wounds throbbed less, and their laughter echoed within the canvas walls. They inhaled until their minds blurred, until every thought dissolved into warmth. When the ritual ended, they stepped out trembling, eyes red, sweat shining on their skin. The cold steppe wind hit their faces like awakening. They believed themselves reborn, free from blood and fear. To the Scythians, Hemp was not a plant for pleasure, but a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Smoke was the language through which men spoke to spirits. The tent was a sacred space, temporary and personal, where the warrior confronted both his mortality and his memories. The fire crackled, seeds hissed, and the scent of burning resin mixed with the musk of men and earth. In that enclosed world, the boundary between life and death thinned. If one compares it to today, it would be like soldiers returning from war and gathering in steam rooms filled with narcotic smoke to wash away trauma instead of seeking therapy. The ritual likely had medical effects as well. The heat opened pores, the smoke acted as an antiseptic, and the induced trance dulled pain. Whether by belief or biology, the warriors emerged calmer and cleaner. For nomads who carried no temples, the tent was enough. It moved with them across the vast grasslands, serving as both sanctuary and confessional. They needed no priest, no written prayer, only smoke and silence. Herodotus may have exaggerated, but archaeological finds confirm traces of hemp seeds and burnt residue inside bronze vessels buried with Scythian warriors. The presence of such artifacts near graves suggests that the ritual extended into death. Smoke guided not just the living but also the dead toward the next world. The same vapours that cleanse the living were believed to open the path to eternity for fallen comrades. The Scythians buried their dead with bows, horses, and hemp, ensuring their journey would not be cold or lonely. The image of hardened fighters sitting naked in a tent, laughing through clouds of hemp smoke, feels strangely human. It shows how even the fiercest sought peace after violence, how cleansing mattered as much as courage. They had no doctors or philosophers, yet they understood that wounds left inside could destroy more surely than those on the flesh. I think there is something profoundly honest in their way of healing, a recognition that suffering needed ritual, not denial. The smoke served as both medicine and memory. Each ritual was a reminder of mortality, of how thin the line between ecstasy and exhaustion could be. The Scythians did not seek intoxication for its own sake. They sought balance after chaos, quiet after thunder. Their tents glowed faintly under the stars, like lanterns on the endless plain, marking places where men learned to be human again after forgetting what that meant. The nomadic life demanded endurance, and the hemp ritual gave it meaning. It offered structure where none existed, order in the wilderness. The men entered the tent as warriors and left as brothers, bound by the shared experience of smoke and release. The ritual was passed down through generations, not written but remembered, like a song without words. Even centuries later, echoes of the Scythian practice lingered in regions where the wind carried the scent of hemp. To later civilizations, their ritual looked primitive, perhaps barbaric. But for the Scythians, it was civilization itself, the act that kept madness from devouring the soul. The smoke was their medicine, their confession, their peace. When they rode across the plains again, faces hardened by wind and war, they carried with them the quiet certainty that they could always return to the tent, to the fire, to the cleansing breath of the sacred plant. The Scythians transformed smoke into salvation. Their rituals reveal a truth older than history itself, that the need for comfort after violence is universal. They found their peace not in silence or prayer, but in the rising haze of a simple plant, and though their empire faded into dust, their smoke still drifts faintly through the memory of humankind, a reminder that healing often begins in the strangest of ways. The warriors who once howled inside those smoky tents left behind more than ashes. They left a legacy of ritual born from pain and resilience. Across the steppes, their fires faded, but the idea endured. Beyond their horizons, other empires would soon discover the same smoke, though not for cleansing, but for curiosity. Somewhere under the Mediterranean sun, scholars and healers were already preparing to write the next chapter of its story. Greek physicians recorded their curiosity in careful ink. Dioscorides, the meticulous herbalist of the 1st century, listed cannabis among the many plants that soothed pain and eased swelling. He wrote of its seeds crushed into oil to calm inflammation, and its leaves softened into poultices for aching joints. For the scholars of that age, it was another discovery to be catalogued, measured, and tamed. They viewed the plant not as sacred or forbidden, but as something to be understood, tested, and contained within the logic of medicine. The Greeks studied the body as a system of balance, where heat, cold, moisture, and dryness ruled the state of health. Cannabis was considered a cooling remedy, fit to calm fevers or burning wounds. It was boiled, ground, and mixed into ointments with vinegar or wine. Physicians rubbed it into swollen muscles or used its juice to rinse the mouth and gums. There was no mysticism here, only function. It feels slightly ironic that the same leaf once used by warriors for transcendence became a mouthwash ingredient for philosophers. The tone of ancient Greek medicine was restrained. Knowledge was meant to dominate nature, not worship it. Healers recorded the plant's effects in practical terms, noting its bitterness, its smell, and its dangers when overused. Unlike in India or Egypt, where cannabis floated through temples and rituals, the Greeks confined it to the physician's chest. The smoke was not burned for prayer, but studied for a symptom. It was one herb among hundreds, stripped of divinity and transformed into data. Roman medicine inherited this cautious respect. In the empire's vast cities, apothecaries stored dried cannabis beside jars of opium and frankincense. Soldiers returning from the frontier used salves made from its oil to ease sprains and bruises. Matrons applied it for earaches or tooth pain. Pliny the Elder, ever the collector of strange remedies, advised it as a treatment for burns and inflammation, but warned of its power to dull the mind if abused. The Romans, practical as always, saw it as both useful and suspect. If compared to today, it would be like a modern drug approved for medical use yet surrounded by whispered fear of addiction. Despite its presence in texts and markets, cannabis never achieved the popularity of other medicines. Olive oil, wine, and honey overshadowed it. Doctors favoured herbs that were visible in effect and gentle in action. Cannabis worked quietly, slowly, sometimes too strongly. It was respected but not loved. The Greek obsession with moderation made it a tool to be handled, not embraced. Its place was always on the edge of acceptance, never in the heart of their healing tradition. There were whispers among the poorer classes who burned the plant not for medicine but for mood. Farmers, sailors, and labourers found relief in its smoke after long hours under the sun. They did not speak of it openly, for Roman law frowned on substances that dulled discipline. The empire valued productivity above peace. To be intoxicated was to be unfit for duty, and unfit citizens were punished. Still, the smoke rose quietly from corners of the ports and camps, curling through the air like a secret no law could entirely erase. The philosophers wrote little about cannabis. Plato and Aristotle debated the nature of reason and passion, but not the herbs that clouded them. Perhaps they knew of it. Perhaps they ignored it. The pursuit of clarity defined their world. Anything that blurred thought was a threat to virtue. Yet even among the disciplined, curiosity remained. Small doses were used to study sensation, to observe how the mind changed under influence. It was the earliest scientific experiment in altered consciousness, though they never called it that. Roman physicians continued the legacy of control. In their manuals, cannabis was a prescription, not a pleasure. A few lines described its preparation and effects, and then it disappeared among recipes for wine tonics and laxatives. To them, it was neither miracle nor menace, only matter. They measured life in function, and the plant's purpose ended where its use did. I think there is something deeply revealing in how they tried to contain a substance that, by its nature, dissolves control. Trade carried the plant across the empire, from the eastern provinces to the streets of Rome. Merchants brought it with spices, oils, and silks, but it never became a symbol of status or luxury. It remained common, practical, and unspectacular. The Greek word for it, cannabis, would survive long after the empires fell, carried quietly through centuries until it resurfaced under new skies. By the time the Roman world began to crumble, the plant had already drifted to the edges of memory. It lingered in medical scrolls and apothecary jars, waiting for rediscovery. The scholars who once studied it left no myths, only notes. Yet those notes were enough to ensure its survival through the dark ages to come. The Greeks and Romans gave cannabis its first taste of reason. They stripped it of myth, defined its limits, and filed it away as a minor remedy. In doing so, they preserved it, unintentionally protecting it from destruction by faith or fear. The ancient empires that once ruled with order and curiosity had made their mark. Their scientists measured, their physicians prescribed, and their soldiers healed. But when their cities fell to dust, the plant would pass into a new age ruled not by doctors but by theologians. Beyond the ruins of marble and empire, the smoke would rise again, this time through the golden light of the Islamic world. Avicenna sat beneath the flicker of an oil lamp, surrounded by scrolls and bottles filled with dried herbs. His book, The Canon of Medicine, would become one of the most influential texts in history, and within its vast pages, cannabis found its quiet place. He described it carefully, noting its cooling nature, its power to calm pain, and its strange ability to alter perception. To Avicenna and his fellow scholars, every plant carried both benefit and danger, and wisdom meant knowing the line between them. Cannabis, with its soft intoxication, demanded balance. It could still the body, ease the stomach, and quiet the restless mind. Yet, in excess, it unbalanced the soul. The Islamic world of that era revered learning as devotion. From Baghdad to Cordoba, scholars studied medicine, astronomy, and mathematics with equal passion. They built libraries and hospitals that gathered knowledge from Greece, Persia, and India. Cannabis arrived among their imported plants, already known for its healing properties. Doctors prescribed it in small doses for epilepsy, migraines, and digestive troubles. The idea was not pleasure but precision. Healing the body was an act of faith, and every cure reflected divine design. It is quietly amusing that a plant now infamous for rebellion was once written into medical textbooks by the most disciplined minds of its time. Within the walls of great hospitals like those in Damascus and Cairo, physicians ground cannabis into powders and pastes. They combined it with honey or vinegar, depending on the patient's illness. The poor received it freely, as Islamic law encouraged charity through medicine. Patients spoke of calm and sleep after taking it. Some said it brought vivid dreams, others found peace from constant pain. For the doctors, it was simply another part of creation to be understood, not feared. Still, faith shaped the limits of curiosity. The Quran forbade intoxicants, warning that substances clouding the mind were the tools of forgetfulness. Scholars debated whether cannabis truly fell into that category. Some argued that its medical use was distinct, its purpose pure. Others saw danger in any plant that altered thought. The result was a compromise. The plant could be used, but quietly, within the walls of medicine, never in the streets or mosques. In a modern sense, it would be like a society permitting morphine in hospitals but outlawing it in homes. This careful balance defined the golden age of Islamic science. Physicians pursued knowledge, yet always within moral boundaries. Their books were filled with details, measurements, and warnings. Cannabis was not romanticized or condemned. It was catalogued, analyzed, and restrained. Avicenna's description of it as both healer and hazard captured the intellectual spirit of the age, where truth was sought not through passion, but through discipline. The scholar's precision extended to every part of life. Pharmacists known as Seydalani prepared medicines with exact proportions, storing them in ceramic jars labelled with intricate calligraphy. Cannabis extracts were among them, their jars sealed with wax and marked with caution. Students learned to recognise the plant by sight, smell, and texture, understanding its effects long before modern chemistry could explain them. The idea that something divine resided in all creation gave their work both purpose and restraint. Outside the universities, the plant travelled quietly through daily life. Traders brought hemp fibre for rope and fabric across the deserts, while physicians carried its seeds in small pouches. Farmers knew its value but rarely grew it for pleasure. Those who smoked it were frowned upon, their indulgence seen as a step away from virtue. Yet even in secret, the habit spread among poets, mystics, and travellers seeking a brief escape from the weight of faith. The Sufi mystics in particular found something transcendent in its effect. To them, cannabis opened the heart, allowing union with the divine. Their poetry spoke of intoxication as a metaphor for love of God. Officially, scholars condemned such practices. Unofficially, many tolerated them as long as devotion remained sincere. The contradiction mirrored the plant itself, forbidden and sacred, calming and corrupting, accepted and denied. I find it deeply human that people of faith, even when forbidden to seek intoxication, still searched for peace through the same smoke they were told to avoid. This quiet struggle between knowledge and belief continued for centuries. Medical texts preserved the formulas while moral writings denounced them. The balance held, fragile but enduring, allowing science to progress without open defiance of faith. The great libraries became bridges between ancient knowledge and modern medicine, carrying with them every recorded use of the plant. When Europe later rediscovered these works, it found in Arabic manuscripts the same descriptions once lost from Greek and Roman hands. Cannabis, long confined by the boundaries of belief, would soon cross those boundaries again. Its reputation, contained for centuries, waited for a world less concerned with sin and more obsessed with discovery. The Islamic physicians of the Golden Age gave cannabis structure and respect. They neither worshipped nor feared it, but studied it as part of God's creation. Their restraint preserved its knowledge through the storms of history. And though the empires that nurtured their science would fade, their legacy of discipline would outlast them all. The scholars who once debated the plant's morality left behind more than arguments. They left formulas, stories, and the quiet evidence of a civilization that valued reason even under divine law. Beyond their cities of light and faith, another world was forming in shadows, a Europe still tangled in superstition, waiting to rediscover what these doctors had already known. Medieval Europe wrapped itself in suspicion. The great cathedrals rose, the monasteries filled with chants, and yet outside their stone walls, fear ruled the unseen. Cannabis grew quietly in the fields, valued for its strong fibres but rarely touched for its mind-changing power. Farmers harvested it for rope, sails, and coarse cloth, nothing more. To most, it was a crop like flax or barley, but to those who looked closer, it carried whispers of danger. Knowledge of its medical uses had survived in fragments from Greece and the Islamic world. Yet the physicians of Christendom treated those texts with caution. Anything that altered the mind too deeply was suspect, a temptation of darkness disguised as healing. The church shaped how people thought about the body, and pain was often seen as a form of purification. To dull suffering could appear as resistance to God's will. Monks brewed herbs for fevers and wounds, but they avoided any plant rumoured to affect the spirit. Cannabis fell into silence, neither condemned outright nor accepted. It was simply excluded, a forgotten remedy hidden behind the walls of fear and faith. It almost feels absurd that a civilization building cathedrals to heaven distrusted a plant that grew so freely at its own doorstep. Ordinary people used hemp daily, though only in practical ways. Its fibres spun into ropes that bound ships. Its oil lit lamps through the long winters. The same stalks that fed industry were separated carefully from their flowers, which few dared to burn or brew. The superstition that followed it was heavy. Women accused of witchcraft were sometimes said to use the plant in potions or ointments that brought visions. These stories spread through villages like smoke itself, unseen but choking. Healers in rural areas continued to use it in secret. They rubbed it into joints for arthritis, mixed its seeds into warm milk for sleep, and whispered old words over the mixtures. Such remedies existed on the edge of medicine and magic. The church, increasingly wary of folk healers, began to blur the line between herbal knowledge and witchcraft. One accusation was enough to destroy a reputation or a life. If we compared this to today, it would be like a pharmacist risking execution for selling pain relief without a license. The fear grew during the Inquisitions. Anything connected to altered states was labelled diabolical. Hallucinations were signs of possession, not chemistry. Smoke that dulled the mind could only belong to demons. This mindset pushed centuries of botanical knowledge into darkness. While monks copied ancient manuscripts, they quietly omitted the parts that mentioned intoxication. The plant that once eased pain in the East has now become a symbol of sin in the West. Still, the fields of Europe remained full of hemp. Every castle and port relied on it for ropes and sails. Armies marched with hemp threads in their tents and uniforms, unaware that the same plant could have soothed their wounds. The dual life of cannabis continued useful, but forbidden. The farmers who grew it did not question its other properties. They were too busy surviving, paying taxes, and praying that the church would leave their land unburned. Physicians who dared to experiment did so cautiously. Some added hemp oil to poultices for burns or gout, noting its cooling effect. These records were brief, buried in Latin, and often unsigned. To claim too much knowledge was dangerous. The medieval scholar walked a narrow path between reason and heresy. Even curiosity had to wear humility like a robe. The people who lived under the shadow of faith sought comfort where they could. Smoke rose from chimneys, incense filled churches, but the smoke of cannabis was absent. In its place were prayers, relics, and silence. The plant survived, not in medicine, but in folklore. Tales told of witches flying through the night on ointments that freed the soul from the body. The truth was simpler: those ointments might have contained cannabis, and the flying was nothing more than dizziness and a dream. I find it haunting how fear turned knowledge into myth, and myth into punishment. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had forgotten much of what the East had known for centuries. The wisdom of Avicenna and Dioscorides lay dormant in untranslated manuscripts. Pain returned to being a divine trial, and relief a dangerous luxury. Healing belonged to God, not to herbs. Those who questioned this order risked being branded as heretics. Their ideas burned along with their bodies. Yet beneath this silence, the plant endured. Seeds still passed from farmer to farmer, woven invisibly into the fabric of daily life. The same stalks that built ships also carried within them the memory of forgotten medicine. When trade routes reopened and knowledge began to flow again, these forgotten fields would become the soil for rediscovery. The medieval world, trapped between salvation and superstition, could not destroy what it feared. It could only ignore it. And that quiet ignorance allowed the plant to wait patiently, rooted in earth, surviving the centuries of fire and prayer. The Europe that feared change would soon face it from every direction. Exploration, trade, and new ideas would sweep across its borders like wind over old fields. In the age to come, the silent plant of the peasants would sail across oceans, carried by merchants who valued profit more than piety. Somewhere beyond those shores, its smoke would rise again, no longer as witchcraft, but as commerce. African tribes treated cannabis as both medicine and memory. The plant was not written about in scrolls or carved into stone, but its smoke drifted through ceremonies that bound the living to their ancestors, in villages scattered across savannas and river plains, It grew wild beside the huts, its scent mingling with earth and firewood. The people called it many names, each one older than the kingdoms that rose and fell around them. To them, it was not strange or foreign. It was part of the land itself, a companion that soothed the body and opened paths the eyes could not see. When a boy became a man, the elders gathered around a small fire. They chewed the dried leaves or burned them in bowls of clay. The rising smoke marked the passage between childhood and strength, cleansing fear and awakening courage. The initiate inhaled deeply, trembling as visions blurred the edge between dream and daylight. Songs rose from the women nearby, steady and low, like the heartbeat of the earth. The ritual was both healing and rebirth, a reminder that pain must always precede wisdom. It is oddly poetic that the same plant that once steadied warriors on foreign plains now whispered manhood into the hearts of boys. Among healers, cannabis was a trusted ally. The medicine men and women used it to draw sickness from the body, believing that disease was not merely physical but a spiritual imbalance. Leaves were crushed and mixed with fat to treat wounds. Seeds were chewed to calm the stomach or soften the edge of hunger. The smoke was blown gently over fevered children as charms and prayers filled the air. These rituals were not superstition in their eyes. They were language, between the living and the unseen, between body and sky. Illness was rarely treated in silence. Drums beat softly as the healer worked. The rhythm guided breath and pulse. The smoke thickened, and the body began to relax. Inhaling was not an escape but participation. The patient breathed in the medicine and exhaled the illness, watched carefully by the community. Healing was never private. It was an act shared among all who cared. If we compare it to today, it would be like hospitals filled with song and incense instead of machines and antiseptic air. In some tribes, the plant played a role in divination. Shamans inhaled its fumes before seeking visions from ancestors or the spirits of the hunt. They said the smoke opened the doorway of the skull, allowing wisdom to pass through. The trance brought answers to questions of crops, weather, and war. The people trusted what the smoke revealed, for it came not from logic but from communion. Yet those who used it carelessly were warned of madness. The boundary between knowledge and chaos was thin, and those who lingered too long in the haze risked losing their way. The plant's reach extended beyond ritual. Hunters carried it on long journeys, chewing small portions to still their hunger and sharpen their senses. Mothers brewed weak infusions for infants restless with fever. Old men used it to ease their pain before death. In every form, it connected life's beginning, middle, and end. Cannabis was a cycle, a rhythm, not a vice. It was never separate from daily life, never named as sin or salvation. It was simply what the earth offered. The spread of cannabis across Africa mirrored the movement of people themselves. Carried along trade routes and river paths, it took root wherever human hands tilled the soil. The plant adapted easily, thriving in both desert heat and mountain cold. With it travelled the stories of those who used it, the hunter who found courage, the healer who banished fever, the mother who soothed her child. No written record survived, but the rituals endured through memory, passed from mouth to mouth like a prayer. European travellers who later arrived in Africa misunderstood what they saw. They wrote of strange customs, of smoke-filled huts and laughter that seemed delirious. They called it savagery, unable to see the order within the chaos. Their ignorance turned medicine into myth, ritual into madness. I find it quietly tragic that the first observers of these traditions looked but never truly saw, hearing only noise where there was rhythm. To the tribes themselves, cannabis was not something to explain but to live with. It was the link between generations, the shared breath that united ancestors with the unborn. Each ritual was both preservation and renewal, keeping the memory of the first fire alive. When drought struck or sickness spread, the smoke returned to the air, a plea to whatever forces governed fate. In every puff of white haze, there was both desperation and hope. Even as kingdoms rose and colonizers came, the old healers continued their work in secret. They hid the leaves among other herbs, whispered the old chants at night, and taught only those who proved worthy. Colonial powers tried to outlaw such practices, branding them primitive, but tradition is hard to kill. The roots ran deep, and the smoke found its way back into every village. The plant, like the people, survived. African use of cannabis stands apart in its intimacy. It was never merely a drug, nor solely a medicine. It was a companion through pain and celebration alike. Its smoke carried both laughter and mourning, healing and farewell. In those moments, one can almost see the unbroken thread that runs from the earliest fires of prehistory to the present. The tribes who turned to smoke for guidance did not see themselves as rebels or mystics. They saw themselves as caretakers of balance, keepers of breath, and guardians of the fragile space between worlds. Their rituals would linger long after foreign ships anchored on their shores. And when those ships left, they carried more than goods. They carried the plant itself, setting in motion its next journey across an ocean that knew no mercy. The lands of the Americas breathed their own kind of magic long before foreign sails touched the horizon. Across forests, deserts, and mountains, the native peoples practiced rituals older than their own languages. Their connection to nature ran deep, but the plant that would later conquer half the world was absent. Cannabis had not yet crossed the oceans. The ceremonies of these tribes burned other sacred herbs, peyote for visions, coca for strength, tobacco for communion with the spirits. Each carried its own meaning, its own doorway between the human and the divine.